I never will forget. We're at his lab one day doing some research, and he looks up and very bluntly he just says, "Your grandfather was a spy." And even if you've had an indication of where the research might take you, to have someone put it to you that bluntly in so many words, it makes an impression.
Hello, I'm Derek Cash with the North Little Rock Public Library System and want to welcome you to Meet the Author. In 1948, the United States Air Force Security Service was established to provide the Air Force with crucial communications intelligence for enhancing the Air Force as a strategic component of America's national defense. Joining us today is Philip Shackelford, a military historian and the library director at South Arkansas College in El Dorado, Arkansas. He is here today to discuss his book, Rise of the Mavericks, the U.S. Air Force Security Service and Cold War, 1948 through 1979. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you for being here. It's such a pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Why don't you begin, Philip, by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Well, again, thank you very much for having me. I'm very, very glad to be here, very honored for the invitation. Like you said, I'm a military historian, a library director at South Arkansas College. We are a two-year college in extreme South Arkansas, about 15 minutes from the North Louisiana line. But perhaps most importantly, I'm a dog dad to a big, fluffy, 100-pound Great Pyrenees dog named Buddy, and he is just awesome.
Where did you attend university or college?
I went to Kent State University, majored in history. That's in Kent, Ohio. Started out as a double major in music and history, played piano, and decided about halfway through I had enough credits for the music minor, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to do the music minor, I'm going to focus on history, and then started looking at what the options might be after graduation. And the Kent State, they had a bridge program where you could begin your graduate work in library science your senior year of undergrad. And so I applied for that program, got in, applied for the history graduate program to do a master's in history. I was waitlisted initially for that program, but was able to get in and go ahead and get started on the MLIS. And then they admitted me for the master's in history, so I was able to do both programs concurrently, and did graduate work there at Kent State as well.
Well, congratulations to you.
Thank you.
When you say military historian, did you specialize, I'm going to presume, in American military history, but did you study other aspects of like world military history or anything like that?
That's a good question. I think with Kent State in particular, they did not have a track, let's say, for what we call traditional military history. When I say military historian, that's just kind of a broad term for historians that choose to study military topics. And there's a lot of different ways you can go with that. What I have tended to do is kind of bridge the gap or kind of do a blend of a little bit of military history, a little bit of organizational culture. It's intelligence history as well, because I'm looking at an intelligence agency throughout the Cold War. So if you put all those in a pot and stir it, that's what I do.
Mm-hmm. Well, before I give you the opportunity to tell us a little bit about your book, I got to admit, I'm glad you wrote about the European aspect, although you start out in the Cold War, because I find that far more interesting, even though you do bring up Korea, than, let's say, the Asian Communist Chinese aspect. All right. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about your book?
Yeah, so Rise of the Mavericks is essentially an organizational history of the Air Force Security Service, which, as you mentioned, was established in 1948 after a few years of kind of organizational back and forth to determine exactly what the Air Force was going to need moving from the World War II experience into what this new thing called the Cold War. How are we going to handle this? The Air Force knew, kind of coming out of that experience, the crucial importance of communications intelligence. Communications intelligence kind of defined as intelligence that represents it's a subset of signals intelligence. Signals that contain messages, contain Morse. It was often encrypted Morse signals that were being decrypted, analyzed, processed, and ultimately fed into the intelligence machine to ultimately inform and hopefully provide policymakers with a better understanding of decisions that they faced. And so the Air Force, kind of coming out of the World War II experience, moving into the Cold War, is essentially riding a high, of the World War II experience, of what they've seen as a decisive demonstration of value and capability during the war. Strategic bombing. This is the heyday of strategic bombing and what they see as their true capability, what they can bring to national defense. but they're still part of the Army. Still called the Army Air Forces at the time until fall of 1947. The National Security Act creates, among other things, an independent Air Force and a larger Department of Defense with these different military branches organized beneath it. So moving into that environment and the uncertain questions that kind of represented the basis of the Cold War, the Air Force knew that in order to be effective as this first line of defense, then communications intelligence was going to be absolutely critical.
Okay. When I think of intelligence, I always think, or spies and secrecy, I always think of like things like the CIA or maybe the FBI.
Absolutely.
How would you define, let's say, the military, Navy, Army, Air Force, but particularly, why do they need to be with their own niche in doing this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a question I think that the folks at the time were wrestling with. Coming out of World War II again and really having had an intense experience during the war of having to put together essentially a patchwork of intelligence groups, different organizations, different units who were all working on intelligence or various aspects of the intelligence business, but didn't necessarily cooperate, didn't necessarily share information that well, and were essentially responsible for a small piece or pieces of the entire intelligence pie and hopefully providing the allies and the American military and government with the information they needed to win the war, which ultimately they did. But that organizational challenge, the kind of dysfunction that existed between all of the different groups who were working in various aspects of intelligence did not go away with the end of the war. And so as we kind of approach the end of the war, American leaders, policymakers, government leaders are fully cognizant of the fact that that level of dysfunction cannot be allowed to continue. We have to figure this out. Whether that's related to national defense, whether it's related to specific military organizations and how they will be organized and how they will operate and what their future missions might be. And so the period of 1945 to 1947, 48 is this incredibly complex and transformative time, I think, in American history writ large, but especially in American military and American intelligence history, where all of these decisions and these debates and these arguments and really the figuring out of all of those questions is being done. And so hopefully I'm able to explain a little bit of that in the book.
Something I learned, I had no concept or idea before I read your book, was I never knew there was such a rivalry, let's say, especially between the Navy and the Army, and holding on to their secrets. I'm not giving them up. And the impression that I got, I can't think of any specific examples, although I think you brought them up in the book, is that the implication being, as a result, because they held on to them and wouldn't reveal things, that maybe, let's say, for instance, Korea, that maybe it hindered military development in Korea. Am I correct?
Well, I think the most famous example that people often point to, even before the beginning of the Cold War, is obviously Pearl Harbor, right? And kind of the lead up to Pearl Harbor, the misunderstandings that may have gone on in understanding the threat, the nature of the threat, and the possibility of the threat with relation to Pearl Harbor. And that really does get back to, again, this dysfunction that existed between, you've got the War Department who's working in military intelligence, you've got a naval group who's doing much the same thing, and in communications intelligence specifically, down to the point that they had essentially divided Japanese intercept into odd and even days of the week, where the Army would do it on even days or whatever the case, the Navy would take the other. So this incredible level of just rivalry and dysfunction and not being able to agree on jurisdiction and responsibility. So leading up to Pearl Harbor, it's not necessarily, we can discuss it as an intelligence failure, and I think there's a lot of people who would characterize it as such. But it's also a system failure. It's not just an intelligence failure that we didn't interpret the right signals. It's the organization was not ready. In many cases, the signals were not there to interpret and not there to collect. And so it was a compounding of a perfect storm that led to the failure, that led to the crisis and the tragedy at Pearl Harbor.
Your grandfather, it plays a big part in this book.
Yes, he does.
Talk about that aspect.
So my grandfather, Tom Shackelford, was in the Air Force Security Service in the early 1950s, was stationed in Scotland, the small air base in southern Scotland, and the security service installation there was tasked with eavesdropping on the Russians. It was one of the northernmost, if not the northernmost installation that the security service operated at that time. And my grandfather's specific role was as as a communications teletype operator to take the data, the intercept, the information that was collected by the radio intercept operators, and be the person responsible for sending that back across the pond to various headquarters in the United States or other commands, other destinations where that information needed to go for further processing or further analysis or whatever the case might have been. Flash forward, to my childhood, kind of coming up, rural North Mississippi. My grandfather would share stories occasionally about, with my brother and I as we were growing up, about his time in the Air Force, and certainly nothing that would indicate, just how secretive an organization the security service really was. And certainly not to a couple of kids who, did not have the context yet for everything that he would have been talking about. But my senior year of high school, we moved with my dad's job to Ohio, Northeast Ohio. It's almost 1,000 miles away. And this was the early days of Skype. My grandparents had just purchased a computer, and he began writing letters. And in those letters began to get a little bit more specific, a little bit more detailed about his experience in the Air Force and in the security service. So for me then at that point, entering undergrad and kind of going through the process of becoming a history major and learning about the things you do as a historian, you're looking ahead to the senior seminar, which is kind of a capstone in the history major. You're going to do a 30-page paper. You need to have a topic that you're going to write about, and kind of casting about for what that topic might be. I kind of landed on the security service as a possibility, and so okay, let me see what's out there, see if this can be done. And was immediately sort of flabbergasted by just how little information was out there. Of course, come to find out, there's a really good reason for that. Security Service was an intelligence agency. It's obviously very secretive. A lot of the material remains classified. But I was hooked and started the process for me in terms of researching just exactly what it was, what kinds of things it had been involved with. And I mentioned it to a professor of mine in a different department that I was working for as a research assistant. And we started poking around, doing a little bit of research, and I never will forget. We're in his lab one day doing some research, and he looks up and very bluntly, he just says, "Your grandfather was a spy." And even if you've had an indication of where the research might take you, to have someone put it to you that bluntly in so many words, it makes an impression.
Yes.
Right. So I stayed with the topic for the senior seminar, stuck with it through grad school, and ultimately to the book.
I think you were fortunate for what you were information you were able to get from your grandfather. The reason as you were explaining this, it reminded me of a woman that I used to work with, Jane Travis. Her father worked for the CIA. They knew that. Her husband's father worked for the CIA. They never knew that.
Right.
The whole time he was there. When they got married, she didn't know it. The CIA hosted the entire wedding, that sort of thing. So her father, for instance, wanted to go to the Soviet Union. I think this was he didn't even apply. He didn't think that the government would let him travel, that sort of thing. So you were fortunate to get what little information, the information you were able to get from your grandfather, because I don't know how much he was sworn to secrecy about.
Well, they were, and they the thing about it is these guys they had zero communication after separation from the service to indicate whether or not they could in fact discuss it. So many went in their entire lives without ever mentioning their service to their families, or without being specific about their service to their families. And so I consider myself very blessed to have had the opportunity to hear those stories and to learn about that experience. Maybe not in the most detailed way, but at least a starting point to kick off this larger journey and learn along with him in this process.
A man that you bring up in your book, Colonel Clocko, or is it Cloco? Clocko, like a clock?
Yep.
Okay. He appears very intelligent and talented, but he was a POW, and I was intrigued. How did he get picked so quickly upon release to work in the military intelligence? I mean, it was almost as if I just thought like he fell from heaven.
How did one thing go to the other?
Yes, so quickly.
It's a little bit of a mystery, and in fact, so there's two oral history interviews that have been done with General Clocko before he passed away. One in 1975 and the other in 1987. So separated by a fair amount of time. The interesting thing is that he almost comes to the point of mentioning how he was selected. And the process that ultimately led to his kind of assignment into the military intelligence machine, but doesn't get specific. It's almost like this offhand. I can tell you how I was picked, but it's not relevant. And he moves on. And so we were left wondering, without this explanation of how did that transpire, we don't know. That's one of those things that, as things continue to be declassified, maybe there would be a source that talks about that one of these days. I don't know, but that would be great to see.
Okay. You bring up, yes, I hope I would like, if you find out and I'm still alive,
I will. Absolutely. I'll send you an email.
Because it just intrigued me. I just thought there's more to this than that, but you can only write about what you know.
Yeah.
Yes, or the information that's revealed. You bring up something that I found intriguing, the military view of the atom bomb and its relation to war and how their interpretations changed. Would you discuss that?
Yeah, and I'll give a book recommendation as a good librarian.
Okay.
I will point you to another resource. It's called To Kill Nations. It's by a professor called Ed Kaplan. And in that book, he talks about what he terms the air atomic strategy, the air atomic theory, the air atomic age. Essentially, this period in time when, coming out of World War II, the Air Force is essentially the most powerful Air Force in the world. It is the most powerful Air Force in the world, having just come through the experience of the war, having just delivered a couple of nuclear weapons. And there's a sense, there's a divide between those that recognize that nuclear weapons have in fact changed and there's no going back. They've changed what we were able to accomplish in warfare. It's not just another weapon. And then there's the school of thought that considers nuclear weapons just another weapon. It's just a matter of scale, right? There's no essential difference in the nature of the weapon itself. So the Air Force kind of has this attitude of leaving World War II and entering the Cold War as, the war is horrible. It's something that we want to avoid at all costs. However, if you're in a war, the only humane thing to do is to end it as quickly as possible. And nuclear weapons provide us a way to do that, right? As you progress through the Cold War, and as things begin to change in terms of how we look at nuclear weapons, particularly in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, kind of moving through the 60s, early 70s, there's a change in emphasis, right? Away from massive retaliation and kind of the air-centric, the strategic air-centric perspective that was very prevalent in the Eisenhower administration, and then moving to a more flexible response model.
Would this be like a General LeMay sort of?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And so you just have this gradual transition away from kind of a diminishing of the emphasis of nuclear weapons towards other options.
Yeah. Okay. All right. You bring up the Marshall Plan, and you say, why did Stalin think the Marshall Plan was a trap? But more importantly, see, when I taught European history, I taught Stalin thought it was a trap, but I never really thought, well, why did he think that? And then you bring up in the book, Marshall hoped he would not accept it.
Yeah.
I found that intriguing. Why did he not want him to accept it?
Well, if I recall correctly, that's actually a quote from Professor John Gaddis, who's up at Yale, and he's written extensively on the Cold War. And if just in a few words, the Marshall Plan, essentially the way it was written, left it open for anyone to participate, right? Not just any specific country or any specific organization. And under that interpretation, the Soviet Union might well have participated in the Marshall Plan.
I know that the Eastern European countries like Czechoslovakia were interested.
Wanted to. Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. So what essentially what it did is it forced Stalin to be the bad guy, right? He could not accept Western help and remain as influential as he ultimately wanted to be, right? And so it's just that forcing that choice instead of the United States kind of making any dividing line or any Western influence making a dividing line, it puts the onus on the Soviet Union and on Stalin himself. Yeah.
All right. I'm glad you answered that question because I don't know how you feel. I'm sure you feel the same way. You hate to think that the United States would do something like that. Yeah. But if you can make them, whoever them are, the enemy, then you look good.
Sure.
And so that was sort of like a defining moment.
Sure.
Okay. I've got something I want to read from your book, and then I'm going to ask you, I'm going to make a comment, but I'm going to ask you to make a comment. It deals with Thailand. It's a little bit long. I'll try to be as fast as I can. Of these, Thailand seemed the best choice, trying to open up, I guess, headquartered or a base or something in Thailand. Indeed, the security service had already established that previously unheard communication signals could be intercepted in Thailand, and the NSA had begun negotiations to locate a security service contingent there as early as 1955. But various demands from the Thai government delayed the process for 3 years. The Thais had external factors to cope with, including communist plots to assassinate Thai government officials, arrests, and Chinese propaganda campaigns. It took an actual crisis, insurgent pressure on an American-supported government in Laos to put these nations into a position where it was imperative that they accept U.S. help and with the admission of U.S. troops to their territories.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going to ask you, what was that pressure?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you know specifically what that pressure
I
is?
I think it's an example of the Cold War playing out in real time, right? You essentially have the dichotomy that the Cold War forced many of these nations to make a decision. They're either Western friendly or they're Soviet friendly, and it's very, very, very hard to remain in the middle. And I think the Thai government was trying to ride that line. They were fiercely independent, trying to kind of remain separate and apart from the conflict that was going on. And I think that what the example in neighboring Laos kind of demonstrated to them is that there are dangers that we might not be able to cope with on our own. It might not be such a bad thing to accept the Americans and what they may be able to bring to the table as the conflict unfolds. So that's my interpretation of that. Yeah.
I had a boss, Pongsak Kanchanakpan. He was from Thailand, and I remember his telling me, and this was back in the 1980s. He said, "At the Miss Universe pageant, Miss Thailand won, and everyone in Thailand said, 'What does America want?' The following year, an Air Force base opened up in Thailand." And when I read this, it made me think of that. I'm thinking, okay, it's just amazing. Every country plays, I want to say it's games,
yes,
but it's just more or less what can we do to get what we want, etc. Yeah.
It's the nature of politics.
Okay. This has been a great interview.
Okay.
I have enjoyed it so very much.
Me too. It's been great.
And we want to give you an opportunity to let people, if they want to contact you.
Sure.
Tell the audience about any social media you're in, and also should they want to purchase this book, how they can get their hands on it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. I'll say for the book itself, you can always go to Naval Institute Press. That's usni.org. It's always great if you can purchase directly from the press if you can. Also, it's on Amazon. It's on Barnes & Noble. Basically, wherever your books are sold, you can find it. Social media, I'm on Twitter at @pshackle. Love to see you there. This month, I'm doing a little series where I'm recommending a different book every single day for the month of June. So if that sounds fun, you want to tag along, then you can check that out. I think you mentioned my website already, philipcshackelford.com, and I'd love to see you there. Post some, essays and things like that on there, and I appreciate it. It's been great.
All right. Well, this has been fabulous. It really has. Well, thank you for joining us today. It has been a pleasure. If you're interested in reading more from Philip Shackelford, please visit his website, Philip C. Shackelford. Now, is that all one word?
Yeah.
And there's no period after the C.
No period after the C.
Okay. philipcshackelford.com, or listen to his podcast at themodernscholarpodcast.com. You can also find more information at our website, nlrlibrary.org, and you can find our book, or his book, at the library as well. Join us again next time. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you very much.